Hey guys, Ramsey here. Welcome to another video. Today we have a review of another desert gem, and the Frederic Malle Desert Gem train continues. Today we're talking about the second desert gem. It's actually out of order because I did the night, then I did dawn, because they were connected in a way. You can go watch my reviews of those two if you want to hear a little bit about that. But now we're going back in time 1 year, and we are going to do Promise by Frederic Malle and Dominique Ropion. And this is a 100 ml bottle of Promise. And I do try and listen to my constituents, my subscribers. One guy left a message saying, I really wish you would spray more on camera. There's just something about spraying on camera. And so I'm not going to promise to do it every time, but I will do it now. But I'm going to spray it over here because God forbid I spray it on my desk. I'll smell it for the next year. And this is going to overtake everything, by the way. Whatever previous dry down I just had, this just absolutely killed. So thank Mr. Spray on Camera for that. But so here we go. So let's talk a little bit about Promise. It came out in 2017. Oh my God. I absolutely love this stuff. I'm not going to lie. I'm a huge fan of Promise. And I will tell you this, as far as folks talking about big fragrances in their collection, this is one of the biggest fragrances in my collection. Vintage, niche, old, new, expensive, cheap, you name it. This fragrance is gigantic. It is huge. It is enormous, whatever you want to call it. I have never smelled a perfume so tenacious as Promise. It will literally rip the paint off the wall. I mean, children will run in terror. It's I almost feel like Godzilla walking into like a Japanese city wearing this. It just feels like it is gigantic. Now, I'm wearing my Stars jersey today. It's game 6. I'm doing this review before the game because if I do it after, I'm just going to be pissed off if we end up losing and we don't make it at least to a game 7. And so yes, that is why we're doing this review now when there is still hope. Although this may be the last time you see me in a Stars jersey until next season. But that being said, back to Promise. It is maybe one of the most unmovable, unshakable. I mean, it is just gigantic. It's enormous. It's huge. It is an atomic bomb of perfumery. Okay, so there is very little, by the way, I've ever smelled that actually smells like Promise. But before we get into that, I want to read the little blurb according to the official Frederic Malle website. So according to the Desert Gem Collection landing page, it says, Promise is Bulgarian and Turkish roses intertwined with the sensuality of a patchouli accord, cypriol, and labdanum, creating an illusion of oud that reveals itself on the skin. In its wake, an irresistible attraction emerges, recognizable to enthusiasts among 1,000. But interestingly enough, if you scroll down to the bottom where they do this recap of oud, where they say oud, the gold of fragrances, and if you look at the box, I actually dug the box out for you guys on this one, so you're welcome. These are not easy to find when you have 600 boxes, but or whatever the hell I have, 500. But yes, I dug the box out, and you can see the gold kind of slip that sits over it. I mean, the usual Desert Gem kind of collection box, if you will. And they say that for Promise, it's oud behind a smoke screen. So in one place they say almost like this enhanced oud accord, and in the other they say oud behind a smoke screen. So I don't know. But the actual blurb, according to the back, says that in the Middle East, a promise made between two people is accompanied by the strictest honor code. Frederic Malle celebrates this principle with a promise of his own, whose beating heart is made of 2 precious varieties of rose. Rose essence from Bulgaria and Rose Absolute from Turkey are lifted by apple, pink pepper, and clove, and bound to a sensual base of patchouli, cypriol, and labdanum. An accord as unbreakable and invisible as a vow. Well, there's nothing invisible about this, I can tell you that. It is an absolute monster. It's beast mode, whatever you want to call it. It is all of that the kids say. It's beast mode, it's huge, it's everything. But one thing about Promise is they are right in saying that if you've smelled Promise, you'll never unsmell it. If you smell it again, you'll know it's Promise. It is very distinctive. There's nothing I've ever smelled that actually smells like Promise. However, there are a lot of oud fragrances over the years that have tried to do something similar to Promise. If you go back in time a couple years from 2017, 2015, Roja I'm sorry, the Spirit of Dubai put out a fragrance called Maidon, and I reviewed Maidon on the channel. It's kind of a leather type Middle Eastern style Oriental fragrance. You can go check it out. I wasn't too impressed with Maidon because I had Promise. You know, if I didn't have Promise, I could totally see myself going for Maidon. But 2015, Roja put out, 2014, Roja put out a fragrance called Taif Oud. It was actually Fortnum and Mason's Taif Oud. They dropped the Fortnum and Mason. Now, I don't know if the, 10-year deal ran out with them. Now it's just Roja's Taif Oud, okay? And you can buy it on the website. It is extremely expensive. It's more expensive than Promise. It's like double the price of Promise. Excuse me. But it gets kind of in the ballpark, if you will. Lots of cypriol. And that came out a couple years before Promise. Also, Amouage put out Opus 6, which I have a review on the channel. And Opus 6, and then they put out Silver Oud after Promise. So they did a couple cypriol type fragrances, if you will. And to my understanding, Opus 6 is a very similar sort of brief as Promise, in that it was supposed to create this oud-like fragrance without using any real oud, okay? Now, what I will say is, with Promise, I would describe it as like a fruity Arabian leather type fragrance, if that makes sense. Even right now, even off the first spray, you instantly get this leather-like accord, which is made up from the labdanum. I've often talked about how labdanum can give you this sort of leathery, sticky, leathery-like feel. I love labdanum. It's one of my favorite type ingredients in perfumery. The other thing that Promise does brilliantly from the very first spray is it is a reference cypriol fragrance. So I did an entire This Is Not a Top 10 cypriol. You can check it out on the channel. This was very close to the top. Go see how high it made it. You can go watch my ranked This Is Not a Top 10 cypriol video if you would like. But this almost feels like kind of the final authority on a heavy, well-done cypriol, heavily synthetic as well, I must say, but very well done. You have to give props to Dominique Ropillon. Oud alternative. Cypriol to me is like the oud alternative note. And, this shows what it can do in a composition to me. Now, hear me very well. I am not stupid enough to say that there's no oud in here, okay? I'm using the words like oud alternative and stuff like that because some of that is actually on the Frederic Malle website. So what they say, again, on Promise is that it creates an illusion of oud. That is directly from the Frederic Malle website. If you go to the Desert Gem landing page, you'll be able to see that. An illusion of oud, right? That's not from me. That's from them. But still, if they say there's a drop of oud in here, they can claim there's real oud. I think they have pretty much surrendered the fact that this is the one that does not contain any oud, I think. But if I'm wrong and the brand says there's oud in here, go with it, all right? Because like I said, on another landing page, if you scroll down, it does have that that claim about oud and, oud being the gold of the fragrance world, okay? So if the brand says it, go with it. But to me, I would say if you really twisted my arm to my nose, again, to my nose, this is the 1 in 4 that smells the least like there's a real slug of oud in there. The Night has the heaviest oud profile, then Dawn, then Moon, and Promise is kind of at the very end, as far as just talking about if you get like a proper oud accord, if that makes sense. It's a lot of cypriol right from the beginning, okay? No ifs, ands, or buts about it. If you've smelled heavy cypriol fragrances before, this will absolutely tickle your cypriol bell, if you will. The cypriol bell will ring in your head, okay? So I also have to mention that it is the most reasonably priced of the 4. So I mentioned how outrageous Dawn and the Night are. This one, you can actually get 50 mils for $295 retail, which is a hell of a deal. You can get a 100 ml bottle like this for $470 retail, okay? Not bad prices at all. We're talking already much, much cheaper than the Night, much cheaper than Dawn, okay? So when you factor in the price differential, it makes perfect sense that Promise doesn't have a giant slug of real smelling oud in the fragrance, okay? But just like the Night and Dawn, Promise's brilliance comes from the genius mind of the perfumer and creative director behind the scenes. So Dominique Ropillon, who I think is one of the greatest perfumers of all time, and then of course Frederic Malle, kind of working together to come up with this scent, this type of scent. So what does Promise smell like? So when you first apply Promise, you're hit with this huge, giant Arabian style leather. And the leather is feels like it's emanating from the base, like that labdanum gives off that sort of leathery like feel and earthiness, okay? And the earthiness is counterpointed with fruit, okay? So the earthiness smells like a blend of fractionated patchouli, which Dominique Ropion used multiple times in things like Portrait of a Lady and The Night. He talked about that on record many a times. And cypriol. So much more on cypriol later. But what I want you to understand from my point of view, and one of the reasons I don't think it's a big deal to use cypriol, and one of the reasons why I actually rank this as very at the top of my Frederic Malle kind of ranking list, if you will, is that cypriol gives this almost oud-like embellishment, like we've talked about, okay? And even if you go to the highest artisanal houses, like for example, I've reviewed an Ensar fragrance on this channel called Jungle Kinam, okay? Jungle Kinam is a very specific type of oud, right? The name Jungle Kinam would make you think there's Kinam in there, right? Well, distilling enough Kinam to put in a fragrance where you're going to have hundreds of bottles out there, you're going to spend $500,000 or something ridiculous on it, right? So even on the artisanal space where you're getting unusually higher quality ouds, okay? Even there is this sort of sleight of hand, I would say, a little bit, because what Ensar ended up doing with Jungle Kinam is using multiple types of oud to create this Kinamic-like accord, this accord that smells like Kinam, but he used different types of oud to do it. So, and I don't think there's much of a difference between someone like Ensar doing it and someone like Dominique Ropion doing it. He used cypriol and a bunch of other things here, patchoulol, patchouli, whatever it is to create this oud accord, right? And sometimes I really do feel like that sleight of hand is not necessarily a bad thing. I think it's the job of perfumers to play the magician, to make you smell something that you think is there and you think you're smelling, but maybe they used a different ingredient to create it, okay? And that's one of the reasons why I like Promise so much. So just like in my review of Dawn, where I said that the fragrance instinctually felt like a take on frankincense. Right from the first time I ever sniffed Dawn, I was like, this is a frankincense fragrance. This is not an oud, centered composition. To me, that is a frankincense composition, my 2 cents. Promise instinctually felt like a take on oud done by materials and ingredients imitating oud instantly. That was the very first thing that came to my mind, and I still feel that way. Okay, so the opening gives off that leathery, sort of Arabian style leather, if you will, very oriental and heavy. You'll probably get a lot of the earthiness from the patchouli and the cypriol very early on. And, everything feels like notes and accords, not uncommon when you're sniffing oud. Okay, so they're trying to create an accord that gives you this oud-like feel without there being oud, if that makes sense. If there really isn't any oud. Maybe there's a drop or two, but whatever the brand says, go with it. So think of the scene in Aladdin where, well, first I have to talk a little bit about the fruit note, because that counterpoint where I said it balances on the fruit note is basically this, the opening gives off this kind of apple twirl-like note. So the fragrance twirls on this apple, but it's not just any apple. It's this big green, crisp-like, sort of crispy, slightly sour green apple note. Not the shiny, red, sweet apple. It's the exact opposite of that, okay? This is a big, bitter, sour, crisp green apple. And imagine the scene in Aladdin where the princess kind of takes an apple and almost gets her hand cut off, and Aladdin kind of comes and saves the day, right? Replaces it, but just replace that red apple in your mind with the green apple, because they're set in the Middle Eastern setting. It's a perfect setting. If the apple was green, it would have been a perfect imagery for Promise. The green apple used here has a smell almost reminiscent of slight cider, okay? So even now I'm getting it clear as day. And it meshes perfectly. And if you go to the Frederic Malle website and look at the Desert Gems, there's all these copper looking mesh. Like imagine you took this box and cut it into like a chain link fence, okay? And there's all of these, almost like copper tubings and stuff like that. Like they're being linked together. Like the different Desert Gems are kind of linked together. And, I talked a lot about kind of the fermentation aspect of oud in multiple videos. I think we talked about it in the last two as well with the Desert Gems, but also if you go to my playlist and pull up any Bortnikov, well, not any, but a lot of the Bortnikov, Arige, Ensar fragrances, that fermentation of oud note will come up in a lot of those artisanal houses. So what's so interesting about this, and I think the genius masterstroke in Promise that I think a lot of people maybe either didn't get or you just don't hear it talked about too much, but I think the green apple and apple cider, okay, incorporates a lot of elements of oud without using oud, if that makes sense. So for example, think about apple cider vinegar. Well, if you go back to my review of the night, I mentioned the oud in the night smelling like vinegar to me, okay? Well, now you have apple cider vinegar. And, you know, if you think about like a apple cider accord, well, that's like a fermented cider is literally the apple being fermented into cider. Not always hard cider. It doesn't necessarily have to mean alcohol, but in America we use the term cider for, you know, non-alcoholic as well. We use hard cider here for alcohol. But you know, if you go back and think about that earthy vinegar-like smell, or think of it like being in a fair or a carnival. Here in Texas, the joke is we kind of deep fry everything. So if you go to like a Texas State Fair, they have deep fried hot dogs where they take fries and hot dogs and lump them together and basically like deep fry it till they like merge together. It's the most disgusting thing ever. Deep fried Oreos, which are actually pretty good. Deep fried sweet tea, which is the grossest thing I've ever seen. Deep fried cheese. Deep fried milk and cookies on a stick. Milk and cookies on a stick. We'll deep fry anything here. Well, in the Middle East, if I imagine like a carnival in the Middle East, I imagine everything is fermented. So in Texas, everything is deep fried. In the Middle East, I just imagine everything is fermented. And I really think that the brilliance of Ropion here is taking this apple note, turning it into this sour, bitter, green apple cider vinegar, apple cider-like feel, which adds this fermentation of oud without being oud, if that makes sense, okay? So you're smelling apple cider. It's just weird enough to be different, but it's just done well enough to be expensive smelling. Okay, it has that niche blob luxury thing that we've talked about in the past. And the longevity of the top note of that apple seems to be turned up to like invincible levels, okay? So it just goes on and on and on and on into the dry down. So you will smell that apple note literally for hours, whereas some fruit notes disappear 5 or 10 minutes on your skin. Not this one. I will be smelling this apple note for literally 2 or 3 hours. It goes on and on and on and on and on. And once that apple note slowly, finally start to recede into the background, what comes forward is something that smells like they literally took the gem from Desert Gems. Imagine like the emoji of the gem, okay? And fermented it. Everything is fermented, right? So imagine something that sparkles like a diamond, shines. I often talk about ambergris or ambroxan as like light shining off of the ocean and getting those 1,000 points of light sparkling into your eyes. Well, imagine like a fermented diamond. There's something that about Promise that feels glitzy, sparkly, you know, glamour, pizzazz, whatever you want to call it. And I think that's the ambroxan. I think that's also what gives this fragrance this huge amount of size, right? Something that you would expect to die out in a couple hours just keeps going on and on and on and on and on. I'm sure that's the amber woody type materials, but it's also the ambroxan, and that gives it that weird fermented diamond-like smell. I don't know how else to describe it, okay? There's definitely this, along with the fruitiness, along with the earthiness, along with the cypriol and the patchouli and the rose, which we'll talk a little bit about. Once that apple recedes, that quality of like refracted light coming off of a diamond moves more and more forward to the smell. Like here is a 5.5 hour dry down. And yeah, it's much more earthy in smell. I can smell the apple move to the background. We're already past that sparkly diamond-like phase, and now I'm getting much more of the earthy patchouli and cypriol. I think the leathery labdanum, for some reason, or something in the right now in the first hour or so, that leather note smells the best in the first hour. Even though you get leather notes into the dry down, it becomes more to the earthy, patchouli, sticky kind of side of things. scratchy patchouli, but not in the traditional sense. We'll talk a little bit about that, but definitely the earthy qualities are allowed to come forward, let's say, as the hours tick by. So especially in the use of the patchouli here, which doesn't smell anything vintage. It doesn't smell like the chocolatey, scratchy patchoulis of the 70s, and cypriol. And the cypriol adds this sort of warming, earthy character to the fragrance is how I would describe cypriol. It's rich, it's woody, and it's smoky, okay? It's smoky without being incensey, if that makes sense. It's the way I think of it is like Arabian patchouli. I'm Arabic, so I can say that. It's like an Arabian patchouli. Is how I like to think of cypriol. It's dark and smoky and spicy is kind of how I would view it. But I think most of the spice and promise doesn't come from the cypriol necessarily. It comes from the clove. And when you add that clove in, remember we're talking about apple cider vinegar earlier, so you add spicy clove to it, and then you really get this cinnamony apple, type feel like you're at a carnival or something, and maybe Texas would do deep fried apples. I'm sure they have it. But, it draws especially with the clove, it definitely draws a comparison to Portrait of a Lady. And then by extension, the night, because of course the night feels like it has that Portrait of a Lady imprint on it. You can watch my review from a couple days ago. Now, I do find it interesting that there is this link between all the desert gems. So if you go to the Frederic Malle website, you'll see, like I said, each one has this copper mesh and these bars kind of running through them like they're being linked together, like a chain link fence. And that link together, I think, is part of an interesting, bigger story. So the connecting flower across all 4 desert gem fragrances is actually this Turkish rose, or Turkish damascene, which links all 4 fragrances together, okay? And it's in all 4. In Promise, they ended up using the Turkish Rose Absolute, okay? And usually when you're talking about rose absolutes, you're talking about the heavier molecules of the rose being used, because a solvent like ethanol is usually used to in the distillation process, and after more of the volatile ingredients kind of float off or fly off, if you will, you're left with a rose note that feels almost like a base element, like a base note, if you will. And so it's a heavy rose, and it has to be, because Promise is a very, very heavy fragrance. Like I said, one of the biggest fragrances in my collection, period. Promise is an absolute atomic bomb. So Promise uses a couple twists and turns, if you will. One curveball that they've decided to add to the Turkish rose is Bulgarian rose. It's the only one of the 4 desert gems that uses a different type of rose in the actual note listing, okay? So they all list Turkish rose. Some like Dawn list Turkish rose and Turkish rose absolute. Others, like the Night, just list the Turkish rose. This one lists Turkish rose absolute and Bulgarian rose, and that's the twist. None of the other 3 desert gems list any other rose except for the Turkish rose or the Turkish rose absolute, okay? So there's a little bit of a twist. And the Bulgarian rose is usually a smooth and sweet type of rose. It's kind of a soft rose historically. And it kind of rounds everything out, all right? So in something where you have a lot of clashes together, the Bulgarian rose works as this almost like taking your finger and kind of smearing some of the paint together and getting that getting the paint to kind of glide together between where otherwise there was a harsh line. Here it kind of smooths everything out. It rounds everything out. There's a gradient to it because of the Bulgarian rose here. Now, the other thing that the Frederic Malle website actually touches on is this metallic twang, and I can't remember if I actually saved the part where it says it. Let's see. Did I save it? Maybe not. Yes, here we go. This is it's actually the main blurb, so you have to find the actual bigger blurb. It looks like they only have like a one-liner on all these. I don't like the new Frederic Malle website, but it says, dark, intense, and mineral. Its depth never seems to end. That's because the fragrance never ends. It's literally never ending. Just goes on and on and on and on and on. But with this metallic twang that they talk about, which I thought was very interesting, or mineralic, as they say. I would say metallic, especially looking at the golden colored mesh that they decided to use. But that metallic feel is here. There is something slightly metallic about Promise. And it could be coming from a few places. I don't know where that, almost like aluminum foil like feel. Like you took that desert gem apple I was talking about, the crispy, bitter, sour apple, and wrapped it up in aluminum foil. It's kind of the way it feels. And of course, underneath you have the spices, the cloves, the rose, all that stuff, right? But that metallic, weird kind of pepperiness could be coming from clove. Clove can sometimes be very pungent, and it can give off this metallic, spicy, peppery-like smell, even slightly smoky. Clove can be smoky as well. And clove can also give off a vintage feel. And remember in the beginning I was saying this is one of the most tenacious fragrances I've ever smelled. Even going back to my vintages, like if you think about something like Furyo by Jacques Bogart, I would say Furyo competes with Promise as maybe two of the strongest, most tenacious, never-ending fragrances I've ever smelled, okay? And I love Furyo. Furyo is one of my all-time favorite fragrances. I love these type of fragrances that are big and bold. The 80s is known for these big, bold, brash, in your face. They weren't shy. They had character. I miss those days. And so this recreates that. Albeit with modern aroma ingredients, it still recreates it. And one thing that clove or eugenol-like smell does is it gives you the feel of spicy carnation. Spicy carnation used to be very famous in vintage masculine perfumery, okay? Carnation was a mainstay in vintage masculine perfumery. A lot of carnation was used in old school masculine scents, okay? Which I love. I love that. And you just don't get that anymore. So here, they've used this clove, which feels like there's this carnation-like feel, even though there isn't. So I mentioned Bulgarian rose. You could almost throw this weird carnation in there. And there's rosemary. And rosemary is a traditional masculine scent going back to something like even Paco Rabanne Pour Homme. There's a brilliant rosemary note in here, which usually smells kind of slightly oily, if you will. It's like an oily herbal-like feel. And there's a little bit of pink pepper, which really makes the rose in here amp up. Like I mentioned, kind of the sparkle of the ambroxan, the ambergris-like sparkle. And the ambroxan in here is very well done for a... There's a lot of synthetics in Promise that I think are very well done. Some people think they're way overdone, but I like this type of perfumery, I must admit. And so the other place that the metallic twang might be coming from are these amber woody-like materials. I think of the 4 desert gems, this is the one that smells the least like real oud, and the most like a lot of these ambery, woody type materials, okay? I think they're the heaviest used here, in my opinion, okay? So I think the Moon may be able to give this a run for its money as far as the amount of amber, woody type materials used. I can't be certain, but I know that the ambroxan and the amount of throw that this has will make everyone smell you. I'm going to go watch the Stars game at like a bar tonight or something, and I'm sure wearing this, I'm not going to do another spray. It's 2 o'clock. The game starts at 7:30. When I walk in at 7:30 from what I just sprayed, everyone will smell me in that room. I promise you. I promise you, Promise is an absolute blast. If you're into beast mode fragrances, you have to give this a sniff. So regardless of the overdose of synthetics in here, I think this is one of my favorite Frederic Malle, period. I love the brash throwback to the 80s style, heaviness. I love the reference cypriol. Like if you want to sort of smell what cypriol would smell like, this is one of the fragrances that you really have to get your nose on. I love the daring, amped up, full blast, let's roll, kind of Arabian style patchouli cypriol mix in here. So you can see I'm a fan. I'm a huge fan of Promise. The part of Promise that I maybe did not touch on enough that I think you may pick up a lot heavier than my nose tends to focus on is the woody aspect. So the patchouli can turn slightly woody into the dry down. Very earthy, okay? It's almost like it's like an Arabian patchouli fragrance is the easiest way for me to put it. They put out Monsieur 1 year before, which was like this huge 50% patchouli or something, kind of old school. This is like a modernized Arabian style patchouli is the best way to put it. But it is woody. There's woody aspects in here, even though there's no sandalwood or cedar wood or anything like that listed. There's no mahogany wood. sequoia, any of the other woods, it feels like there is this woody forest-like feel, okay? I'm not really sure where that's coming from. I'm guessing it's coming from this big patchouli. Dominique Ropillon really got to know patchouli and got intricate with the different types of patchoulis used. And basically what they did with Portrait of a Lady is they took this patchouli and they basically call it fractional distillation, where they kind of split it up. They split up the patchouli and they can almost like break it up like a science experiment and say, okay, we want this part of the patchouli in there. We don't want this part. We want this part in. We want this part out. And so I wouldn't be surprised if they continued to play with that experiment here and working with the cypriol and maybe some oud notes that are not listed, maybe norlimbinol, maybe black oud. I have no clue. I'm not, like I said, I'm not a perfumer. But my guess is they worked with something like that to give it that spicy, woody character that will remind you of oud. Everything in here reminds you of oud. Some ouds are fruity. Some ouds are woody. Some ouds are leathery. The labdanum gives off the leathery aspect, the apple gives off the fruity aspect, you know, so forth and so on. The patchouli and cypriol give off the woody aspects, and it just feels like everything is designed to kind of imitate oud, right? And they've done a fantastic job. I think they've done a fantastic job. I love Promise. It's one of my all-time favorite Dominique Ropillon creations. I think it's, as a lover of 80s perfumery, I just love how big and brash and bold this is. This is my kind of fragrances. So if you have a experience with Promise or the Frederic Malle Desert Gem line, I'd love to hear your thoughts. I'm hoping to do the Moon next so we can knock out all four. So as always, it's a pleasure doing these. Even though I am wearing Promise in the middle of June for you guys, it's probably 90 degrees today, but I have no problem wearing these Desert Gem fragrances in the heat. No problem, never have. Never had a problem wearing them in the heat. So, but I'd love to hear your thoughts as always. I appreciate everyone watching, commenting, liking, subscribing, all the amazing stuff you guys do for the channel. It's a joy and a pleasure doing these videos for you guys. So cheers, and I'll catch you next time. Bye-bye.